Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to our July WAMinar, which is How to Combat Unconscious Bias. My name is Carla McGrotty, and I'm the WAM Programme Coordinator here today at AHEAD, and I'm going to be your host and MC. So like most of you here today, AHEAD staff are all working from home, and that includes our presenters. So please do bear with us if the webinar is a little bit rough around the edges. Connections may drop, construction work may be happening in the background, dogs may be barking, so please just bear with us here today. So just before we kick off, I just kind of want to introduce you to some of the different accessibility features that we have here today. So we do have live captioning available. So it's on the bottom of your screen and it's the CC button. So you should be able to click CC and live captions should appear then. I also have my co-host Angela Glancy. So Angela is going to be in the background. You're probably not going to see her today. You might hear her. But she's going to be answering some of your questions that you may have within the chat box and also in the Q&A box. So we do have a couple of different features. There is a Q&A feature, so it's QA down at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions that are for the presenters here today, please do ask the questions directly into that, because that's where we can keep on track of all the different questions. The other feature is a chat box feature, so you can chat with other attendees, you can share your thoughts, observation, everything like that. If you do put a question in there, we are going to try and monitor that, but again, if you put them in the Q&A box, that would be great. And just for those that are on social media, we would really appreciate if you could use the hashtag, which is hashtag WAMinar, WAMINAAR. So before we kick off here today, I just want to introduce our two presenters. So we have Dr. Ashley. So I don't know what happened there. I think my slides have went there. Technical difficulties as always. So our two presenters here today is Dr. Ashley O'Donoghue, who's the Head of Staff Development within TU Dublin. And we also, our second presenter is Shona Dunmerku, who's a Disability Employment Specialist. So, and I don't know if you can hear that, but that's the dogs barking in the background. I would like to get Angela to launch our first poll of the morning. So we have 3 different polls here today. So Angela, if you wouldn't mind launching that poll, which is going to just ask you kind of, your sector and background. So you'll see the poll kind of coming up on your screen now. If you are on a mobile device, I know some people, they may not be able to see it, or if you're listening in via phone, you won't be able to vote in the polls. So there's 2 questions. So please select which one is most appropriate to you. You work in HR, you're the disability officer or access officer, you're a hiring manager, a line manager, or just a regular employee. The second question, we kind of just want to get to know where everybody is coming from today. So the first option is public employer, private employer, higher education, further education, an NGO or not-for-profit, and the last option is other. So I can see that we have 128 attendees watching here today and just 82 that have voted. So I might just wait for that for a little bit. So while that's kind of going off in the background, I just wanted to give a bit of insight into who AHEAD are and what the WAM program is, for those of you who don't know who AHEAD is and what we do. So AHEAD kind of works to create inclusive environments in education and employment for people with disabilities. AHEAD's actually been around since 1988. The WAM program itself is a project of AHEAD. So we're funded by the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. It was set up in 2005. And what we do is we work with employers to provide paid work placements or internships for graduates with disabilities by ring-fencing roles, particularly for those people, for a period of a minimum of 6 months. To date, we placed over 470 graduates, and about 80% of our graduates actually secure full-time work as a direct result of that work placement. If you want to find out more information, go to our website. There's a lot of information on our website. And just for those who don't know, we actually have a new employers information meeting that's going to be happening next Tuesday, the 14th of July, and that available is on our website as well if you're interested in finding out and working with the WAM program. So I'm just going to end that poll now, and I'm going to share the results on the screen. So the results should be sharing on your screen right now. So about 27% work in HR, 14% are either a disability or access officer, 6% are a hiring manager, 17% are a line manager, and 38% are regular employees. In terms of sector, we have quite a high proportion of public employers here. So that could be people from civil service departments or other public sector bodies. 48% are from that area, 15% are from private employers, 26% from higher education, 4% from further ed, 7% from not-for-profit, and 1% is other. So I'm just going to stop that share results here now. And Ashley, if you wouldn't mind coming on the screen and start sharing your video and mic, and that would be great. And also if you could start sharing your slides, that would be fantastic as well.
No problem. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Ashley O'Donoghue. I'm Head of Staff Development, as Caroline said, in TU Dublin. I'm going to share my screen now with you. Here we go. And everybody should be able to see that. So I'm going to talk to you for, we've 25 precious minutes to talk about what is unconscious bias, what does it look like in recruitment and selection, and how can we control our bias. The reason we're talking about unconscious bias in recruitment and selection is because recruitment and selection is such a high value decision around who gets access and when people are hired in, what opportunities do they get. So bias is a huge factor in terms of equality of access and equality of opportunity within organizations. So for this morning, for the 25 minutes that we have, we're going to look at hopefully changing your knowledge and understanding about what is unconscious bias. Hopefully change your attitude about becoming more aware of when you can see your bias kicking into how you interact with people, how you make decisions about people, when you're particularly around high value recruitment and selection decisions. And hopefully the ultimate goal would be if we could change behaviors, that, you know, that we learn to control our bias, which is really, really difficult, because as we work through the presentation, you'll see we all have bias. It's how we're wired, it's how we think, it's part of our makeup, it's part of influenced by our culture, our upbringing, and so on. So it's very, very difficult to actually control our bias. But helping to understand what it is, what it looks like, and helping to change behavior would be the ideal goal. So as I mentioned, unconscious bias is the biggest threat to a fair and robust recruitment and selection process, because I'm sure we were talking earlier to Shona Domaraku, and we were talking about, you know, the number of cases around disability and discrimination in the WRC, and Shona will mention a really good report by the NDA. Most of our organisations have equality policies. We have the Employment Equality Act, and still we have a high number of cases ending up with discrimination in the WRC. So the biggest threat, even though we have policies and procedures, the biggest threat is bias, because policies and procedures are implemented by people who naturally bring with them their bias and implement policies through a biased lens. Okay, so this is the best example I can get to explain to you what unconscious bias looks like. In TU Dublin, we've unconscious bias training through our leadership development program, through our recruitment and selection license to recruit. So you can't recruit in TU Dublin until you're fully trained in recruitment and selection procedures and in unconscious bias, and also in performance management, because these three areas in terms of leadership and who controls resources and opportunities, in terms of recruitment and performance, these are key points in an employee's life cycle where bias can really impact equality of access, equality of opportunity. So have a look at this one, and it's very relevant now that we're all home working. And what I'll do is I'm going to get you to look at the clip, and I'm going to get Angela then to run a poll afterwards to ask 2 questions about the clip.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals? And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change? I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me. My apologies.
And out they go. Okay, so I'm going to get Angela to run the poll, and the question is, how many of you who saw, you may be seeing this for the first time, or it may be a number of times since you might have seen it a few times before, how many people who thought that the woman who burst through the door to retrieve the children was the nanny? And looking at that scenario, that situation, what evidence did you use to come to the conclusion that who this person was who came through the door? So how are we doing, Angela? Are people voting?
I think we have, it's me, Caroline here, Ashley, so we have 60% of people voting.
Great.
We actually have 139 people watching the webinar at the minute, so which is a great number. So about 70% at the minute.
Great. Okay, so I think we could nearly run the results. Okay, so 55% of the people who are seeing this clip believe that the woman who ran through the door was the nanny. 45% are more aware of their bias and didn't make that assumption. What evidence was used? Age, race, gender, other. Okay, and all of these factors, age, race, gender, are all protected grounds under the employment equality legislation. And we're making a decision about somebody and stereotyping a role based on their age, race, gender, and other characteristics. It's so you can close the poll, would be great. It's a really good example and the best example I can come up with around what does unconscious bias look like in action. So in terms of the first time I saw it, I assumed that the woman who came through the door was the nanny. She's his wife. And then there's the whole area of race, gender, age had influenced my decision, my background, my culture, and also not expecting an interrace couple. So all of these factors were bombarding my thought processes. And I made my mind up when I saw the poor woman running through the door. I said, oh no, that nanny's going to get fired. In a space of nearly 2 seconds, not even 2 seconds. That's how quickly our thought processes take in information and come to a conclusion which may be very flawed based on information, physical characteristics that have actually no bearing and are perpetuating stereotypes. So this happens all of the time. Caroline's going to kill me, but I'm going to get you all to unmute your mic really quickly and ask a question. I'm in higher education. What do you think a professor looks like? Any takers? What would you say a professor looks like?
Is this for the panel, Ashley? Yeah.
No, this is for anyone who wants to jump in. Anyone who wants to jump in, tell me what a professor looks like.
I suppose we have a few people who have raised their hands. So I'm just going to allow Fiona Delahoy to talk.
Yeah, great.
So she should be able to. Do we hear Fiona?
Hi. Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. No. I was only raising my hand to answer the question. Sorry.
No worries. Okay. Do you want to put it in chat so everybody has access to chat, haven't they?
Yeah.
Okay. So if people want to put into chat, what do you think a professor looks like? Any takers?
Answering it there.
Yeah. Okay, just opening up the chat here. Okay, I'm going to move because I can't see your chat, but typically when I ask a question like that, especially if we're face to face, I'll get the response that we need to give this professor some peace and quiet here.
Yeah, actually some of the answers that are coming in is more likely to be male and white.
Yeah.
White is male, older, well distinguished, longish grey hair, glasses, Dumbledore, older. You know, some people said female and stuff like that, but yeah, most people are saying kind of male and older. Great.
Okay. So yes, that is role stereotyping. That's what it looks like. Okay. And typically I would always give the professor a dicky bow as well until I become more aware of my bias. But this is a Google image. If you Google professor and images, and this is from maybe 1 or 2 years ago, but this was what came up. So it was typically, as you have said, white, older, male, sometimes with glasses. So can you imagine if you're sitting on a recruitment and selection panel, if you're sitting on a promotion panel and you work in higher education, and as people come through the door for interview and you have this stereotype of what a professor looks like, it can influence how you value the contribution of that person, which will impact the questions that you ask, how you interact with that person. That's if you're not aware of bias, and that's if you're not some of the people who've said it's female, it's somebody younger. So imagine if you are a young person of color who walks through the door. You can see there on that Google image of professor and stereotyping in terms of roles, the only professor of color is Eddie Murphy. Okay, and actually, as somebody said, you know, female, there's no female professors listed there at all. So, you know, the Google struggled so hard in terms of images to identify professors. We even have a professor from The Simpsons and Professor Green, who's a rapper. And what's really worrying and concerning about this is unconscious biases are influenced by media, by culture, and role stereotyping, and stereotyping is reinforced by our culture, our education, our upbringing, our religion. All of these factors are impacting biases. One of the things that is concerning is around algorithms. So some of your organizations might be using artificial intelligence, and what's happening here is the algorithm is actually learning to be biased as well, because as people Google the image of a professor, and the more and more people who click on and select the older prof with who's white, who has glasses, who has a beard, who has a dicky bow, the algorithm is learning that that's what a professor looks like. That's what role stereotyping looks like. And unfortunately, role stereotyping influences bias within recruitment and selection. So in terms of unconscious bias, we make shortcuts to our thought processes, and our biases are influenced by our culture, our upbringing, stereotypes that happen within the media. It impacts how we think about people, how we view others, how we interact with them, how we interpret them, how we value them. And the thing about unconscious bias is it leads us to make decisions based on stereotypes, not on any objective criteria. So those of us who selected that the woman who ran through the door in the BBC clip was the nanny, based on what grounds? On her age, her race, her gender. Okay, and these are protected grounds rather than any other information that was made available, and it happened rapidly. Okay, so in terms of bias, we are all prone to bias. It's because of our upbringing, our thought processes, reinforced by culture, by media, by education, by religion. We tend to categorize people into in-groups and out-groups, and we categorize them based on physical characteristics, age, race, gender, shared interests, similar lifestyles, similar background. And the thing about this is it happens rapidly, as we know, in terms of our thought processes. It can lead us to stereotype, and we tend to put people into in-groups and out-groups. What happens is, if you're not in my in-group, research shows that I'm less likely to trust you, to have empathy towards you, to understand you and understand your perspective. If you're in my out-group, I'm less likely to trust you. If you're in my in-group, I make the assumptions that you're like me, I know how you think, and I trust myself, so I trust you. So you can see how stereotyping can cause some people to be discriminated towards or discriminated against, depending on whether they're in an in-group or an out-group of those people who are making the decisions, or those who hold power and control of resources. So this is a really good example of role stereotyping and how it can happen from such a very, very young age. So have a quick look at this one.
This afternoon, we're going to draw people doing different jobs. And the first job we're going to draw is firefighter.
Have a think in your head what a firefighter looks like.
What's your firefighter called?
Mine's called Firefighter Gary. Firefighter Stan. Firefighter Simon. He's big and strong. He's got a big helmet on.
That's brilliant, isn't it? Next, we're going to draw a surgeon. Have you thought of a name for your surgeon?
Jim Bob.
Jim Bob.
He's a brain surgeon. I think he would wear a stethoscope. He gives you medicine.
That's his ambulance. Okay, next, we're going to draw a fighter pilot.
This is his jet plane. He rescues people. He likes to do stunts in the air and stuff.
Okay, now who would like to meet these people for real?
Babe, they're dressed up.
My name's Tamsin and I'm a surgeon in the NHS.
My name's Lauren and I'm a pilot in the Royal Air Force.
My name's Lucy, I'm a firefighter in the London Fire Brigade.
Okay, so what's really telling about this one is role stereotyping happens from a very, very young age, and biases unconscious bias influence how we interpret and take in information and assumptions and decisions that we make. It causes us to stereotype. But what's really important, my favorite part of this clip, is when one of the children shouts, "They're dressed up." because there's 140 different types of biases, and I'm not going to take you through all of them today, but the most prevalent bias is affinity bias, where we like people who are like us, that we can discriminate towards people who are like us and discriminate against people who are not like us. And also confirmation bias, where we seek out information to reinforce our perceptions and our opinions and our what we think is the case. And that's what this child is doing. They're trying to seek out information to disprove what they're actually seeing, that the evidence that they're seeing. And that can happen in recruitment and selection as well, when you have that lovely wide open question in there as a competency that you're going to measure against called fit. You know, fit with the team, fit with the organization. That's a lethal question. You don't want that question in any recruitment and selection process that you're doing, unless you're going to qualify what fit is. So if fit with the team means that fit with the team, that you're very autonomous, that you don't need much direction, that you can work alone, because this is a team where there are people working independently, you need to qualify it, because otherwise that particular question is a really good example of where confirmation bias can slip in, and you can move the goalposts in terms of what's being measured to suit not objective criteria, but your perception of decisions that should be made. Okay, so we're saying that unconscious bias, we all are prone to bias. It's because of how we're wired and how we think. And we see bias across lots of different aspects of life. So for example, in sport, there's research that shows that basketball refs give higher fouls to people of opposite race. So both white and African-American referees demonstrated own race preference, giving higher fouls to people of the opposite race, ethnic group. Also seen in terms of employment race, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? And the answer is yes, 50% more likely to be employed. Again, inferring people's race and ethnicity from names. And this particular lady experienced this directly. So Kayo Anashike was trying to get employment. She'd sent out her CV a number of times and heard nothing back. And then she decided to change her name to Kayla Benjamin. And 10 days after sending out her CV, she had a new job. And there's lots of examples of this happening in recruitment and selection around really, even at the shortlisting stage, when somebody sends in their CV and inferring from somebody's name, their race, their ethnicity, and making either being discriminating towards or against somebody. Here's an experiment that was conducted around gender and bias in recruitment and selection. And again, this happened at the shortlisting stage. So there was never even a human interaction. This was gender being inferred from somebody's name and role stereotyping happening in relation to what does a manager look like? So what does a professor look like? What does a manager look like? So in this experiment, they were hiring for a lab manager. So they used the same CV 127 times, and each time they randomly assigned either a female name or a male name to the CV, and they sent the CV out to different panels, and the panels would look and rate the CV, and each time the panel rated the male CV more hireable than the female CV, even though it was the same CV. They chose a higher starting salary for the male CVs, and also said they would offer more career mentoring, which provides better opportunities, excuse me, for career progression. And what's really interesting about this experiment was the gender of the selector did not affect the responses. So both male and females had a gender preference towards male CVs and managers in terms of role stereotyping and whatever other assumptions were bombarding their decision making. And in recruitment as well, disability, and only last year there's plenty of cases within the WRC where we see that there's discrimination on the grounds of disability. So in this case, an application for employment was refused on the grounds of the candidate's historical illness and disability without any regard to looking at a reasonable accommodation or trying to have an understanding of their existing condition, which is really, really key in terms of recruitment and selection. There are plenty of cases in the WRC where, the WRC has found against the employer because they didn't make time to understand the nature of the disability and what reasonable accommodation could have been put in place. And I know this morning, Shona Gomarku will talk to you very much from her lived experience from this point of view. So, an employer can't decide that a person with a disability is incapable of doing a particular job without actually considering what appropriate measures can be put in place. And this is where unconscious bias creeps in. We can make assumptions, particularly about people who are in our outgroup where we don't understand their lived experiences. We can make assumptions about what people can or can't do. You know, in this case here around the lab manager and why was female not valued equally as male CVs, you know, factors like the potential for maternity leave also can infiltrate and influence, although there's no hard evidence that you know, somebody, if you have somebody within, well, for a start, from maternity leave and from a gender perspective, it's one of the protected grounds. But I always, you know, think that in terms of having a person working within an organization, we have somebody today. So, you know, making assumptions about getting somebody's contribution right now is really, really important. What is somebody contributing to the organization right now in terms of the objective criteria that are required for a role? Really, really important. And if I was to give you one piece of advice in how to focus your recruitment and selection process and keep it fair and ethical, so that it supports equality and inclusion, is make sure that from the very start you have a very clear job description with clear objective criteria, and they inform every part of the process. So for example, your job description is free from discrimination, that every candidate is measured equally, everyone is given equal consideration, every candidate is asked the same question. So I'll give you an example of, from my own perspective, confirmation bias. My research background is in leadership, and I went for a management role with an organization. And I was asked a question, and this is definitely confirmation, the best example of confirmation bias I have. The question the panel asked me was, your research is in leadership, I suppose you're very good at leading and managing people. And I thought, this is great, am I going to get away with this? And I said, yes, I am. And we know there's no correlation between researching leadership and actually the difficult, complex job of leading and managing people. And I asked myself the question, I wonder, were all of the other candidates given such an easy question? And I can assure you they probably weren't. They were probably asked, if you had two people working on your team and they just weren't working well together, how would you address this? Or if you were to implement a change. So there was confirmation bias going on, a discrimination or a bias towards me, which was a benefit. I was offered the job but didn't take it. But it's an example of how other candidates in that pool that day weren't given the same consideration or opportunity that I was with that easy question. Okay, so unconscious bias can cause us to stereotype, to discriminate, and to prejudice. And we know that discrimination is illegal under the Employment Equality Act. We can't make any you know, decisions based on age, race, gender. You have all of the 9 grounds there you can see. And what's really important, discrimination means treating somebody less favourably, not giving them equal access, not giving them equal opportunity. And I know Shonad will talk to you a little bit about this. And what's really important in terms of recruitment and selection, each part of the recruitment and selection process has a risk of bias being woven into it. So in the job description, and how people apply and where people get access to information, really, really important in terms of accessibility. What criteria are you using for selection? Are you asking all candidates the same questions? How are you scoring people? Are you attributing value to people in an unbiased and a fair way? And what questions are you asking at interview? So we see that inequality can exist across a number of protected grounds, across different sectors, different continents. So we know from the CSO that only 36% of working age people with a disability are employed compared to 73%. And I know AHEAD and the WAM programme are doing their best to up those stats in terms of that 36%. What's really important is visibility. So being able to see people like me who work in an organization, being able to see others who are like me is really, really important. And the Guards are doing some work towards this around race and minority ethnic groups. So only 2% of applicants were from minority ethnic groups in their recruitment drive. So they decided to make accommodations around the uniform, permitting turbans and hijabs. And we know from my own sector in terms of gender equality in higher education, we have a particular problem where only 21% of professors are women, and women are falling out of the career pipeline in higher education. There has been no female president of a university, and similar statistics within US corporations. Only 11% of board membership is made up of women in the Fortune 500 companies. So we can see, even though we have policies, we have legislation, that inequality can exist on any of the protected grounds across a number of sectors and continents. And why do we have unconscious bias? Well, you know, people don't intentionally go out to discriminate. They don't intentionally go out to be biased, you know, typically. It's all to do with how we think. And I will give you all a piece of homework. There's a good website and longitudinal piece of research that's taking place in Harvard called Project Implicit. And it measures our bias on lots of different grounds. But even when we know we're being measured, you know, we can't hide our bias, but we can learn to be aware of it. So I would definitely encourage you to go away and look at the Harvard Implicit longitudinal study. So why do we have bias? Well, we know that bias is to do with our thought processes. It's to do with how we think. We're unaware of it. It happens outside of our control. It's automatically triggered because we have to take in huge amounts of information. So we process information rapidly. That's how we've evolved. It's how we survive. It's how we knew to run away from the dinosaurs. It's how I know not to step out in front of the Lewis. I need to be able to take in huge amounts of information, process it very rapidly and make a decision. But sometimes that processing and that type of thinking is not good for high value decisions like recruitment and selection. And we know that bias is influenced by our background, our culture, our environment, our personal experiences, and the media. And this is a really good example of our thought processes. So we think in two ways. So Kahneman says we have systems one thinking and systems two thinking. As they say in the L'Oreal ad, this is the science. So our natural mode of thinking is system one. It's fast, it's unconscious, it's automatic, it's good for everyday high value decisions, but it can be error prone. Like when the woman ran through the door, the professor's wife, and I made the assumption she was the nanny, purely based on her age, her race, and her gender. So systems one thinking is our natural mode of thinking. It's how I know not to step out in front of the Lewis, and it's good. It's how we survive and survive and evolve. It can be, it's very detrimental to high value recruitment and selection decisions. And it can flourish when we have a bias blind spot, when we're not aware of bias. So that's why we use this training, for example, just purely to create awareness that our thought processes can be influenced by bias. It's highlighted under stress and time pressure and low blood sugars. So for example, when you're on a recruitment and selection panel and you're trying to rush the decision before lunch or rush a decision so that somebody can make the earlier train at 5, that is not a good position to be in, because we start to slip over into fast thinking where we don't look for objective evidence, where we don't give everyone equal consideration. The power imbalance, if the chair on the panel is a very senior person and you don't want to go against their decision, and there's plenty of cases in the WRC as well where, you know, clear discrimination was found in recruitment and selection, and a number of people sat around that interview table and signed an appointment form where maybe an essential criteria wasn't met by the candidate who was appointed. Why did nobody step up? Okay, was it fear? Was it power imbalance? If you're on an interview panel, you're there in equal capacity. You're there for your expertise and your input. You have to call out and challenge bias where you see it. So if you see that somebody is only getting, somebody from one of the protected grounds, for example, is getting 10 out of 20 for their project management on the competency framework that you're measuring, even though they've managed a project of 500K and delivered it on time, whereas somebody who might be a preferred candidate has managed a project with a budget of 10 grand and gets scored 18 out of 20. You need to question why that is, why there's a differential in the scores. Where we need to be to control bias, and I know I'm conscious of the time here, where we need to be to control bias is in systems two thinking. We need to be aware. We need to understand that bias can influence decisions. Policies, organisation values, and support from senior people all help us to create a culture where bias is understood and where you know, policies and practices are implemented, hopefully free of bias. So we need to try and bring ourselves over into systems two type thinking and to slow down our decisions and look objectively at the evidence. Okay, so I may not be responsible for my first thought. It can be unconscious. but I am responsible for my second thought and my first action. And I'm going to finish up on that, and I know that you'll all get copies of the slides as well. The last slide I wanted to look at is, in terms of, we talked a little bit about the bias. How do you control your bias? Question your assumptions. Are your actions in line with your values? Make yourself and others accountable. Take a risk and speak out. And a really powerful way to try and counteract our bias is to connect with people in our out group and disrupt the default. Have the courage to call out bias when you see it. Okay, Caroline, I'm going to pass back over to you.
That's great. Ashley, thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind just stopping your share, that would be great. And we do have 2 questions. So if you wouldn't mind, Ashley, if I could ask you both of those questions now. Yeah. I think you might have covered a little bit. I'm not too sure if you could probably answer the second one, but the first one comes from head CEO Dara Ryder. And he has asked, aside from staff training to raise awareness, what can employers do to build into their systems or procedures for recruitment and progression to mitigate against unconscious bias? So apart from training, what else can you do? I think you spoke a little bit like that on the last slide, but if you wouldn't mind just sharing some good examples, that'd be great. Yeah,
we're lucky in higher education that with the issue of gender equality and women falling out of the career pipeline, we've partnered in higher education with Athena Swan. And Athena Swan is really a methodology. It shows you how to look within the whole system of the organisation and find out where could bias be. So I'll give you an example. So for those people who aren't from higher education today, Athena Swan is a methodology of how you audit. You gender audit your organisation. So you could disability audit your organisation, you could race audit your organisation. But what's really important is you're looking, as Dara said, beyond just training and development, which can often just be a sticky plaster, right? Be a superficial thing. You need to get down into, what are my processes? What are my culture? So for example, the types of things where bias and discrimination can be seen is on, say from a leadership perspective, who gets to do what work? Who gets to do the high value work? So what that looks like in higher education, who gets to go out and work with big organizations and do research, who gets to stay at home and do the admin, okay? What's valued for promotion? Who gets to go on what project? Who gets to be picked on different committees within the organization? Is it done through a tap on the shoulder? Because committees, projects broaden my perspective of the organization, increase my strategic view of the organization, make me more effective when I go for promotion. So straight away, looking at how work is allocated, who gets to sit on what committees, who gets to work on what projects. There are 3 different things outside of training completely that we've learned from Athena Swan that can have an impact on, can be influenced by bias and have an impact on my career progression. I hope that was useful, Dara.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Ashley. I think that the second one as well that we have, so the Irish law seems to focus on employment. Is there another similar law to protect people when they're seeking services in private and public sector? So I know that we talk a lot about the Employment Equality Act because, you know, the WAM programme is focused on that particular area. But in Ireland, we do have a number of other legislation, which is one is the Equal Status Act, which is combined with the Equality Act. Am I right in saying that, Ashley? You probably might be able to answer that better than me.
Yeah, so the Equal Status Act is looking very much around access to services, and the Employment Equality Act is covering, is that what the question is?
Yeah, so what other kind of laws are out there when people are accessing services in particular, both with public and private sector? Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I think it's the Equal Status Act that kind of covers.
Yeah, sorry, Caroline. Yeah, it's the Equal Status Act is around, is purely covering access to goods and services, and you can't be discriminated on the grounds of any of the protected 9 grounds in relation to your access, you know, to anything around a service, training and development, whatever it is, you know, renting accommodation, all of that. So it's the Equal Status Act that covers it.
Brilliant. I think just one last question has come in now before we move on to our next speaker. So is from Sojeg. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name right, but can you remind me what is the type of bias training that is compulsory for your staff? Is it possible to access that training elsewhere? Is it outsourced within your organisation?
So it's unconscious bias training, and it's all of our leaders who go on the TU Dublin Leadership Development Programme. They have unconscious bias training delivered around how work is allocated, who gets what opportunities, and to try and help them to understand that decisions they make around holding information, allocating resources and work actually can influence somebody's career progression and somebody's access to opportunity. We do it in the performance management training, so that there's research that shows people in terms of bias, it can influence how we value people's contributions. So people typically who are in our out group, who are not like us, we often tend to undervalue their contribution, whereas people who are more like us, we put higher value on it. And all of those pieces of research are in the references at the end of the presentation. And then the recruitment and selection, we call it the license to interview. So you can't sit on an interview panel unless you are trained in the process of interviewing, and you can see where bias can creep into decision making. We don't outsource it. We have trainers trained within TU Dublin who deliver it to all our interview panel members.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Ashley. So if you could hang on for maybe some questions and answers at the end of the session.
Great.
Great. So if I could ask you to stop your video and mic, and then I'll invite Shona to start sharing her video and mic as well. So Shona, do we have you? Yep, we do.
Hi.
Very welcome, Shona. So I know you don't have any slides here today, so I'm just going to let you take the floor, and I'll shut off my mic and video. We have about 15 minutes for yourself, Shona, and then we have about 10 minutes of Q&A at the very end. So just for attendees watching, we do hope to finish just after 12:30. We might go a little bit over, 5-10 minutes over, but just to give people a heads up on what time we're finishing today.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name is Jonah O'Muraku, and I've been working in the field of disability and employment for far too long at this stage, over 20 years. And just to let you know as well, I used to work on the Ahead WAM program, the Willing Able Mentoring program. So it's kind of like the good old days working with Angela, Caroline, and Dara. So hello, Dara. Hopefully we can all catch up again soon whenever we're able to leave our homes. So the reason I'm here is not just because of my professional experience, but it's also my personal experience. I've got a lot of lived experience of disability. As you can see, since I got this arm, I've been calling myself the Bionic Woman online on my Twitter and LinkedIn handles, so it's easy to find me. But essentially, I had an accident when I was 18, and I was burnt in a fire, and I lost both my legs and my right hand. But that kind of experience has really shaped my perspective. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, really, I suppose. The personal and systemic and structural bias that exists in the area of disability, and in particular in those areas in recruitment and just in management in general, where those pinch points or sort of bottlenecks about disability really live within recruitment, retention, promotion, and management, of course. And I'm going to leave you with a few top tips as well at the end. So before we kick off properly, I want you guys to just pause and reflect on something for a moment. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm not going to do a poll because this is only for you. The most important thing, I suppose, is if we are going to be challenging our biases, we do have to look and ask ourselves the uncomfortable questions often. So have a little think. Have you ever, knowingly or unknowingly, discriminated or shown bias against someone with a disability? Now, I want you to hesitate before you actually answer that. Don't answer it straight away in your own head. Reflect, because even if you belong to the out group, like I do, it's still possible, of course, for you to feel pity for somebody with a disability or to be inspired by their brave, inspirational story. And we all do it. None of us are immune to it. I mean, essentially, what I have come to call ability bias, I think it affects us all. Because when I had my accident, in my frame of reference for amputees when I was 18, well, it was only really two things: either bad guys, Bond villains, Darth Vader, or soldiers blown up in a war somewhere. And it was really, really difficult, essentially, for me to actually have an idea of how I was going to progress and how I was going to get my independent life back again, because there were no positive role models out there for me to actually talk to or hear their experiences. The only reference points I had were from popular culture, and they were all negative. But even though I had a lot of lived experience and positive experience of disability, it was still really difficult for me to actually come to terms with the way the disability impacted on me. I had been to school with people with disabilities. I'd been to college with people with disabilities. I had them in my family. I had heroes of independent living in my life. And, you know, essentially I had lots and lots of lived experience. And of course, after watching Star Wars, I had Luke Skywalker as well as a good positive role model. But even with all of those positive role models and the idea of independent living out there for me, it still took me quite a while to be able to acknowledge that I was already biased against myself, because of the stories that we tell ourselves, because of the way that society treats people with disabilities, either as saints or superheroes, or essentially as angels or devils. It's one of those situations that we can't stop doing it. However, we can try and manage it, especially in the workplace. That instinct to make a quick decision, the fight or flight response, yes, it's very useful, in particular if you're in a situation where you're in danger, but you're not really going to be in danger in a conference room or in a Zoom chat at all. So the view and the perception is still always negative, and it is going to impact your worldview. I'd love us to actually think about whether we could actually change the worldview of disability in general, change the world for the better. So just to save you the embarrassment, after your reflection as to whether you've actually discriminated against somebody with a disability yourself, I'm going to share times when I've actually done it. And I've shown affinity bias because I don't understand their particular disability. So maybe it was the time that I asked a visually impaired guy whether he drove to work, causing him to fall around laughing, or when asking someone about previous supports that they had and actually making them really upset because I brought up some of the worst points in their life. Or maybe even when I felt pity or been inspired by those people with disabilities that I've worked with, and I don't want to feel that way. It's one of those situations where, because of the circumstances that have surrounded them, I'm the one feeling pity for them. And of course, as Angela, Dara and Caroline would know, I'm the worst for putting my foot in it. Even though I don't have any feet, I'm forever doing it, always saying the wrong things. The interesting thing is, this COVID situation, it was a great leveler in the beginning when everybody was locked down. And it felt to me as if this wasn't the first time I've done lockdown. I've been sick many times in my life and I've had to stay at home for my own health. But this was different. Everybody was at home. And it felt a little bit like we were all missing out. But now that everybody's going back to the hairdresser, I'm still at risk. And it's one of those situations where it hasn't really leveled things for people. However, I imagine that the conversations when people with disabilities are asking to work from home now are going to be very different to the way they were before. My own experience of ability bias essentially has happened so many times in different interviews. And the funny thing is, I've told the stories so many times, and I suppose I kind of, maybe play them for comedic effect nowadays. So people don't always believe that these things happened. But I once had an interview where somebody was so distracted by my arm, I actually had to hide it under the table and conduct the interview like this, because they just would only talk to me about my arm. Entire interviews for 40 minutes where we only talked about disability and prosthetics and advances in prosthetics. And I never got a chance to actually talk about my abilities or my skills or any of the important things that I was actually there for. And of course, worst for me has been when I have gotten sick. And all of a sudden I become from an essential member of the team to somebody who can't be relied on anymore. And whether that's true or not is irrelevant. It's the perception of it that's been the difficulty. Because so often performance is judged about people with disabilities before they're used to their supports, or even without having any supports at all. And I think those systemic and structural barriers are sometimes the most impactful on people with disabilities in particular. So I want you just to do a little visualization for me, okay? I want you to imagine that you're back in work, and we'll make it the before time, before coronavirus, when we all used to hug, kiss, and breathe all over each other with abandon. You're in the office, and it's a really exciting day for you. You've got a new member of the team joining, and you've got a new boss joining. So the new member of the team is the ideal candidate, the person you've been looking for such a long time. What does that person look like? And again, you don't have to tell us. You can leave your biases to yourself, but you should be aware of it. This new boss that's coming to start, you want to imagine that they're going to be like a great leader that you admire. So have a little think about a great leader that you admire, whether in the business world or the entertainment industry, whatever it might be, or even in your own family. Think about what that leader looks like. And that new boss that you hope is going to emulate the skills and abilities of the leader that you admire. What does your new boss look like? Now, I know without you guys having to answer that more than likely none of those people have a disability. And when it comes to those people that we admire, we can often look at the world in a very different way. So for example, you might see a beautiful hotel bedroom. All I see is carpet and difficulties when I have to maneuver around that bedroom in the middle of the night. You might see a luxurious bathroom with a sunken bath and a jacuzzi. All I see is difficulties, and really essentially like an obstacle course that I'm going to have to traverse in the dark when I'm half asleep. If you thought of a leader, and obviously they're not going to be a person with a disability, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but even for me it can be quite difficult to be able to see those abilities of somebody with a disability. When I've asked this question before in training sessions, some people have answered, oh, Beyonce, she's my leader. I want to grow up to be a strong, beautiful Black woman who's able to express all of these things. And, you know, she did win an award recently for Michelle Obama. However, as someone with a disability, when I think of Beyonce, I just think of a case that was taken last year by her visually impaired fans, because Beyonce.com had absolutely no descriptions for all of the pictures that they had there. So you might think of her as a hero, somebody to admire, but as somebody with a disability, and don't worry, I have actually emailed Michelle Obama. She hasn't gotten back to me yet. But the important thing is we can never just judge one person through the lens that we see them, because there are many different lenses with which to see somebody. So when we talk about those structural and systemic biases, they are so impactful for somebody with a disability, because essentially the disability ground is the only one that needs to be accommodated in the employment and, of course, in the provision of goods and services. But the pinch points for me when it comes to disability and employment are always around the management, recruitment, retention, promotion, and all of the various movements within the workforce. Because that idea that we underestimate a person with the disability's performance is really integral to the whole thing. Whenever we ask somebody with a disability whether they can do a particular task in a job, we often imagine how we would do it if we had their disability. But essentially, you're only working with half the picture, because you can't imagine what it's like for a blind person to see, and neither can I. So we must talk to the person and engage with them, in particular when you're talking about reasonable accommodations, because the reasonable accommodations are what makes the difference between supporting and actually making sure that somebody can compete on the same level. It isn't about an unfair advantage. It's about making sure that people can actually compete at the same level. Because there is a difference between equality and equity. Fairness might be giving everybody the exact same type of entry system. So we do that already. It's equal, isn't it, to give everyone the same recruitment process to go through, online recruitment process. That's fair, isn't it? But when it comes to disability, you must accommodate. So you must go one step further and provide supports for those people that need it. But equity would actually be removing all of the barriers altogether. And that really is the best way to actually think about how to remove those difficulties and those barriers that we actually have. When it comes to reasonable accommodation, it is so important, and it can be so difficult actually to work out how to do it properly. A great guide, as Ashley mentioned as well, is the Reasonable Accommodations Report that was recently done by the National Disability Authority. I can share it after the webinar, but essentially it looks at all of the different areas where reasonable accommodation was essential at recruitment and management and retention stage, maybe when somebody acquired a disability, and where those people and employers just made simple mistakes. often, and you'll see a thread running throughout the report. It's a fascinating read. Really, there was a lack of discussion. People didn't want to talk about the uncomfortable things, and that's only embedded within their own bias. And really, you have to ask yourself, what am I wanting to know here? So while you do need to make a conscious effort to actually uncover your own bias and understand your own biases, don't forget, by the way, that the Harvard Implicit Association test is totally biased against people with two hands, just so you know, because you have to hit two different letters on the keyboard. And essentially, you can't solve inclusion using just unconscious bias. You've got to take action in a bigger way to make sure that inclusion is actually about hearing all of the voices at the table, not just the loudest. And practice what you actually learn in your recruitment decisions, when you choose who to be promoted, who to be developed, who to go the extra mile for. All of these things are full of bias, in particular performance evaluation reviews. So stop and think then think again. There's a really good video that I recommend that you actually go and see. It's Kirsten Pressner's TEDx talk from 2016. And she basically gives us a really, really quick and easy way to test our own unconscious bias. Flip it to test it. So if you think that people with disabilities aren't capable, and maybe people without disabilities are as capable as could be, flip it. Does it make any sense? Is something weird here? Then you've uncovered your bias. So essentially, be aware of the affinity biases that you have. Accept that you have them and that they exist, but make sure that you can actually address them. And don't forget, double discrimination or having a number of different protected grounds, such as maybe being a person of color, having a disability, and being of the Muslim faith, is actually going to have a greater compound effect than each of those individual issues by themselves. So try to expose yourself to disability stories and consider where in your particular recruitment are those pinch points of disability. Flip it to test it is a great approach to use, and her TED Talk is, I think, under 10 minutes long, so you can definitely get a chance to watch it. And just be aware of that distinction between equity and equality, especially when we think about assistive technology. Is assistive technology going to be fair and non-biased if it's all been designed by white high-tech geeks? Possibly not. And definitely, we can't ignore the fact that for many people with disabilities, maybe the assistive technology doesn't even recognize that they have a face. In your organization, make sure to increase awareness and accountability and work in partnership with people with disabilities to actually remove those barriers. So I'm going to wrap up now and just leave you with one image, if you just don't mind. I just want to show you what I mean about the difference between equity and equality. Just a quick one. You can see in the image to the left, you have each person being treated fairly, all being given the same supports, fairness. In the middle image, you'll see that the person on the right-hand side, the shortest person, and it is an adult, not a child, has been given boxes to be able to support them. So they've been given the different supports that they need, and each person's given different supports. To me, that's reasonable accommodation. But in the third image, everybody can see and everybody has been treated with equity because this systemic barrier has been removed. And it's those systemic barriers that can be a huge difficulty. And lastly, I'm just going to share with you my top 10 tips. And I know that, that the guys are going to share it with you afterwards. So everything that I mentioned, including the TED Talk, is listed there. And of course, when I talk about systemic barriers, we're talking about all of the different issues, legislation, policies at national level, and the way that we just see disability in general. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I'm going to mute my mic now and stop sharing my screen, so we can do our Q&A.
Thanks very much, Shona. And I might just invite Ashley back to share her video and mic. Actually, Shona, where have you gone? Have you gone? Oh, she's back
Still here.
So there is a couple of questions actually, and I'm glad we do have that top 10 tips that we're going to share with all of the attendees. Does have the link to the TED Talk, because I think a few people were going to go, what's the TED Talk called? So I think that will be shared after the webinar here today. And I see actually you were kind of answering some people's questions as well, but I suppose just in case people haven't seen it, I think one of the questions you were asked actually was, how do you manage your bias when you observe someone with a disability underperforming, you know, if you're a co-worker and if you're a manager? So I think actually you had answered underneath that, but you might kind of just say that, if that's okay.
Yeah, so somebody had asked if they were a manager and a co-worker and somebody who has a disability is underperforming. And really the response was, you know, be objective. It's the same approach that you would managing any employee, but you do have the added responsibility that you need to check in with the person and find out, well, are they clearly responsible, or, you know, do they know what they're responsible for? Like any employee, are they very clear on their deliverables? Do they have the skills to do it? They are questions you would ask any employee as a manager for underperformance, and, you know, what supports are needed. But then there's the additional question, is the underperformance related to their disability? And as Sean had said, you need to ask the question because you don't understand. And it may be that the underperformance is related to the disability, and a very minor reasonable accommodation might actually, you know, address this. So ask, I think, is really important. And I see Shona is trying to get in as well.
You're dead right. Ask that question and make sure that the supports are adequate before you start looking at performance, because I think people with disabilities in general, we do a lot of covering. There's been times where I haven't actually requested the supports because I haven't felt that it's a safe space. So, you know, is your colleague underperforming because they're not supported? Is it a disability issue? Are they having troubles at home? You know, do they need further support? And is there something going on that you don't know? Is it disability related? Is it performance related? Is it work related? And is it supports related?
Yeah, in the WAM program, we do the needs assessment process. So, you know, before our graduates would commence the work placement, we would do a needs assessment to try and identify those gaps and where they can be supported reasonably by the employer. And there has been time kind of, you know, they are in there for 6 months, and after 2 months, the manager has kind of approached us and said, not too sure if this is a disability related issue, or are they just actually not able to do the job. So there is that support mechanism there when graduates are placed to our program, that we can go back out on site and do a revised needs assessment to identify, you know, whether there can be other further supports implemented, or, you know, in some cases, you know, it isn't actually disability related, and we've actually kind of had to close placement down. So, but it's important that conversation is had, you know, definitely. I definitely do think that that's our approach that we take in the WAM program as well.
I think, Caroline, that's really important what you say there. You know, is it disability related, or is it just underperformance, and is it a management issue that somebody is not fully clear about what they're meant to be doing, or they haven't been properly trained on what they're meant to be doing? So, you know, where our bias can creep in is that we make the assumption somebody is underperforming because of their disability. That may not be the case, and that's where bias can creep into management decisions.
Brilliant. So we have one question here. What is the role with age with unconscious bias? At which age unconscious bias is maximum, or is it not related to age? So I think that's a question we have there. Does anybody want to take that? Shown it?
I think Ashley's video showed it. Those kids, I think, were 6 or 7. But there's a whole documentary, and there's 2 episodes of it that covers this whole thing. So, you know, in 2 hours you can have a look through it. But it's basically, I think you have to search for No More Boys and Girls. Can our kids go gender free? It's 2 episodes that are free on YouTube. And basically it shows that kids decide whether they can be astronauts or not based on their gender at about between 5 and 7. Would you agree, Ashley?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, biases are developed at a very, very young age. And what happens is they become reinforced over time. So in terms of age, as we get older, and those biases are reinforced. So I would go back to the chat earlier on. Some people said, I said the professor was female because I have a friend who's a female professor. So straight away in terms of their neural networks, they're programmed in their mind to believe that a professor can be male or female. But if I've grown up and I've never seen a female professor, or I've never seen, you know, a female fighter pilot, then I'm going to assume that they're always male. So depending on how we experience through life and culture, our neural pathways can become programmed to be biased and to stereotype. So as we get older, it becomes more difficult to change how we think. But as Sean had said, those biases are developed from.
So essentially, we think that, you know, we try and persuade 16, 17-year-olds to actually go and join STEM subjects, but they already decided they couldn't be a scientist when they were 6. So I think we have to start having these conversations all of the time. And I love that program, No More Boys and Girls, because it actually starts to tip everything on its head. It involves the parents and the teacher, and you begin to see how genderized our society is.
Brilliant. So I think we just have time for 2 more questions. I think there was a question for you, Shona. Did you call out your interviewer for focusing on your disability so much that time when you were when they talked about your arm?
I am going to tell them a secret now, Caroline. I hope you don't mind. Most employers mightn't realize that somebody with a disability or somebody that brings a lot of experience to the table, they're interviewing you as well. So, you know, by the time that I got to that stage, I had already decided that this job wasn't for me. You know, and I think that that's part of it. You can do all the training in the world, but if somebody lets their bias run away with them during an interview, forget about it, even if you want to recruit that person. There was a great example I heard about, you know, kind of a friend of a friend of a friend's dog type story. But basically the person didn't know me at all, didn't know anything about disability, and the interviewers made some comment like, oh yeah, the only people that work here are those that, you know, if it doesn't break you, it makes you stronger. Well, you know, unless you had a disability. Ha 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 ha. Now, that person had no disability connection, but that attitude was something that they didn't want. So they turned down the job. I think it's important to remember that disability and the attitudes don't just affect those of us in the in-group or out-group. It doesn't affect just us. It affects a lot of other people. So I think whenever we're expressing our biases like that, or we need to check them, essentially, to make sure that they don't creep into those type of situations.
Brilliant. So we have 2 more questions here. We will finish up in 2 minutes. So an anonymous attendee says, sometimes when you're consciously trying to be unbiased, you can almost end up being negatively biased towards others. So when you're trying so hard, you end up actually being biased towards other people when you're not actually meaning to. So how do you try and combat that? So maybe Ashley, I'll get you to answer that one.
Yeah, I was thinking Shona would be probably more experienced because, you know, from her lived experience, but I suppose it depends on the situation. So for example, if you're trying to be, you know, you're going out of your way to be unbiased, what is the situation? So if it's in recruitment and selection, for example, or if it's in allocating work as a manager, fairness, equity that Shona talked about is really, really important. So if it's recruitment and selection, if you have a good process in place and you are conscious of your bias and you are conscious of, yes, treating everybody fairly and giving everyone equal access, and if you are working with candidates who have a disability, that you realize, well, I need to make extra accommodations, so that, you know, I suppose not to end up with a scenario like Shona just talked about, where there's a complete unawareness of bias, unawareness of people's behaviour and unawareness of the impact that their behaviour is having on others. Likewise, managing and allocating work and giving people opportunity, really important. Sean had mentioned about, you know, outgroups. Give people from your outgroups an opportunity. Try and make time to connect with and understand people from your outgroups. But it means pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone.
I think just knowing, being aware of the bias that you might bring to bear on a decision, I think will actually help mitigate it in the first place. I mean, I often think of this arm as a great example. People see the arm first and nearly can't talk to me because they can't think of a single phrase or something to say that doesn't have arm or leg in it. You know, oh, can I give you a hand? Oh, geez, I really put my foot in it. Oh, Jesus, she's no legs either. So it's nearly like as if the bias in our heads has told us, right, don't mention legs or arms. Don't say, oh, it'll cost an arm and a leg. But that's the only thing that they can think about. So I do think as well that once you start to become aware of it, then you can start to at least mitigate it. Whenever I talk about this arm, if it's behaving well, it's female. And if it's behaving badly, it's male. So it's quite obvious to me that I have a bias towards female leaders. I think a female manager is going to be better than a male manager. And I think when you're aware of it, you can't stop seeing it.
Brilliant. So just one last question before I let everybody go. I know we're just slightly over time. So where has that question gone? It's from Column. So recently, both the Supreme Court and the High Court have criticised rulings of the Labour Court, particularly in relation to, there was an SNA case last year where the Supreme Court had actually overruled the decision that was taken in the Labour Court around, you know, reasonable accommodation and discrimination in the workplace. So I suppose his question is, you know, how, and probably, I don't know if you can answer this, but it's probably a topic for another webinar, but is how do we address bias in the system to protect our rights, you know, particularly if that was a Labour Court ruling, but then it was only on the basis of appeal that the decision was overturned. So I suppose systematic, it's a very broad question to be honest, but does anybody want to take that before we finish up? Sinead?
Just, I suppose, on that particular case with the Marie Daly and the Nano Nagle case, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission are actually going to produce a code of practice. So similarly to the code of practice on bullying, as I'm sure you're fully aware of, Ashley, as well, it's going to be something that employers can take and run with. When it comes to reasonable accommodations and managing it, we've got a great example there from IBEC and ICTU, which is the Reasonable Accommodations Passport. Implementing a system like that makes sure that you can actually protect the rights of everybody. But I do think that that code of practice is going to be very interesting, and I know that they are engaging with people with disabilities as well, because that's how to remove the systemic and structural barriers. Ask someone who's in that situation. I mean, there was the famous time when the Department of Transport wanted to have a big launch of their, you know, access to trains and buses, and, you know, it's going to be so much easier for people with disabilities. They had all of these speakers with physical disabilities, and they had a great stage and launched the whole thing, and loads of wheelchair users were there, but none of the wheelchair users who were speakers could get on the stage because nobody remembered to bring a ramp. So, you know, essentially there was a bias there because nobody who was organising the event had a physical disability or had ever had to deal with that issue. So I do think that you've got to include people to remove those.
Brilliant. So both Ashley and Shona, thank you so much for today. If you wouldn't mind stopping your mic and video share, and I'm just going to bring up just one last screen just to share with attendees, just to kind of inform you guys about what's happening over the next couple of months here in WAM. So over the next few months, so next month we have our webinar, which is going to be around assistive technology. So that's on the 12th of August, same time, Wednesday, 12th of August, 11:30. It's available now to register on our website. It's a free webinar. And just for those that don't know or want to get more involved with the WAM program, if you're a new employer and you're really keen to find out more about how we can support you, you can register for our webinar next Tuesday on the 14th of July. So the website is ahead.ie/WAMinars, but also if you just go to ahead.ie, it's on the right-hand side then as well. You can just click in, you'll see the links to register there. So there will be a Survey Monkey sent out to everybody at the end of this webinar today. So on that note, thank you all so much for coming. I think we had our highest ever attendance yet. I think we had at one point 150 attendees, which is absolutely fantastic. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming this morning, and I'll see you next time.